I was about to lift my fork when my phone buzzed quietly against the table. A message from Noah, my fiancé, lit up the screen. "Do not eat. Trust me." His words were simple, but they sent a jolt through my entire body. Noah's eyes met mine from across the table. Steady and urgent, but he said nothing more. My sister, Vanessa, sat just opposite me, her smile calm and poised, yet there was something in her gaze that sent a chill down my spine. It wasn't the first time I'd felt this weight between us, the way family can quietly fracture the unspoken battles beneath the surface. Just a week ago, I'd received an anonymous email with a photo of Noah talking to a woman I hadn't seen in years. Tonight, that same woman sat close to Vanessa, whispering and laughing as if plotting something I was meant to miss. My name is Harper Collins. I'm 33. This is the story of how my own sister nearly destroyed the life I was building and how I found the strength to fight back. The clink of silverware against porcelain was almost hypnotic, a background rhythm to the soft murmur of voices and the faint sound of waves outside the window. We were at the Seaview Terrace, a polished little restaurant on the edge of Santa Monica, where the salty breeze slipped in each time the door opened. My parents were at one end of the long table, my sister Vanessa sitting across from me with her perfect posture and that faint practiced smile. Noah was diagonally across, close enough for me to catch the lift of his brow when the server set my plate down. My phone face down beside my napkin buzzed once. I glanced at it just enough to see the words on the screen. "Do not eat. Trust me." For a second, I thought I was imagining it some ridiculous autocorrect or a wrong number. But then I looked up. Noah's eyes were fixed on me, his jaw tight, and he gave the slightest nod toward my plate. I felt the blood rush in my ears. Every movement around me suddenly seemed sharper, louder. The laughter from my uncle down the table grated. The way Vanessa leaned toward Chloe Mason, her so-called old friend who had somehow been invited tonight, felt deliberate. I forced my lips into a polite smile, hoping no one noticed the stiffness in my fingers as I set my fork down. Noah leaned forward under the guise of adjusting his water glass, his gaze never leaving mine. The air felt thicker, as if the entire room had shifted just a few degrees. I tucked my phone into my lap and typed a quick reply under the table. Why? He glanced down briefly as his own phone lit, then back up at me. Later. Just don't eat. I wanted to ask 100 questions, but Vanessa's voice cut through my thoughts. Her tone was syrupy, the kind she used when she wanted everyone else to think she was being sweet. She asked about my dress fittings in front of everyone, adding that she hoped it was something flattering. My mother gave her a warning look, but Vanessa only sipped her wine and smirked. The salad in front of me looked harmless enough. Fresh greens, candied walnuts, thin slices of pear. My stomach turned. I pushed the plate slightly away, pretending to reach for my water. Out of the corner of my eye, I caught Vanessa's hand. She slid her own plate toward her, swapping the position of her fork with an easy grace, then nudged my plate closer again. Her fingers brushed the rim lightly, almost fondly. I slipped my small recorder out of my bag, palming it as I adjusted the strap over my chair. My thumb pressed the button until I felt the soft click of it starting to record. My voice, if I used it, would be steady. I had learned that much in my family. But my heart pounded against my ribs and my skin prickled with the sensation of being on stage in a play I hadn't rehearsed for. Noah kept the conversation going with my father, who was describing some new golf course he wanted to try. I nodded in all the right places, my mind elsewhere. Every so often, I caught Noah scanning the table, his gaze resting on Vanessa for just a moment too long, as if making sure she wasn't about to do more. Chloe leaned in toward Vanessa, her laughter a little too bright. I could hear snippets about some party they'd been to last month. My name was dropped once, then the two of them glanced my way in unison. Vanessa's eyes were flat when they met mine, and for a moment, I felt that old childhood shift, the one where I was back in our kitchen 11 years old trying to defend myself while she told a story that made me the punchline. The server came by to refill drinks, and Noah took the opportunity to slide his own plate in front of me, swapping it for mine with an easy motion. He murmured something about me needing more dressing, but I heard the edge in his voice. He drew my plate toward him, setting his fork down without taking a bite. No one else seemed to notice, or maybe they didn't care. I busied myself with the bread basket, breaking off a piece to give my hands something to do. My mind was spinning through scenarios. Food poisoning, allergens. Something worse. Noah wasn't a man to exaggerate. If he said not to eat, there was a reason, and that reason was sitting 2 seats away, wearing my bloodline and a carefully curated facade. The minutes stretched, but the dinner rolled on. My mother asked Chloe about her blog, and my father started talking business with my uncle. Vanessa kept her focus on Noah now, asking about the timeline for the house renovations he and I had been planning. Her tone was friendly enough, but every question carried a subtle weight, as though she were measuring his answers for cracks. I smiled when I needed to, laughed when the table expected it. All the while the recorder sat in my lap, catching every word, every pause, every false note. Vanessa's eyes met mine once more, and in that moment she pushed the salad bowl just a little closer to my side. My stomach nodded. Her smile was almost imperceptible, but it was there, and it told me exactly what I needed to know. I decided then I wasn't touching a single thing she'd had her hands near. I set my bread down and reached for my bag. As I shifted, the recorder clicked softly in my palm. I slid it back inside, the tiny red light blinking against the dark fabric, and took a slow breath. I could wait. I could play along. There was time to figure out what she'd done, and more importantly, why Noah had caught it before I did. For now, I sat back, let the sound of waves through the open windows wash over the tension, and pretended to be just another woman enjoying dinner with her family. Inside, my mind was already moving, memorizing every look, every gesture, every word. There was something here worth holding on to, and I was going to find out exactly what it was. Vanessa had been acting different for weeks before tonight, and not in the way most sisters do when a wedding is coming up. It was not excitement or the easy teasing we sometimes managed on good days. It was sharper, like she was probing for cracks. Every time we spoke, her questions came wrapped in compliments that did not feel like compliments at all. She would ask if Noah was really ready to settle down, or if I thought living in the same house would change him. She smiled as if these were harmless observations, but her eyes never softened. Noah and I had been together since the spring of 2020, back when the world was quieter and staying home together felt like the safest thing we could do. We learned quickly how to share a space, how to argue without shouting, and how to find joy in the simplest routines. He proposed last year on a weekend trip to Napa Valley, just the two of us on a hillside as the sun was setting. It was the kind of moment you think will only exist in movies until it is your own. I remember calling my parents right after, still breathless. My mother's voice was warm, my father congratulated us in his reserved way, but Vanessa only asked if I was sure. She laughed when I told her she sounded skeptical and said she just wanted what was best for me. Since that day, every interaction with her had an edge. At family dinners, she found ways to mention Noah's work trips or how some men marry for convenience. If I defended him, she would change the subject with a shrug, leaving me irritated and wondering if anyone else noticed. My father Daniel never called her out. He had always been her biggest supporter, even when she was wrong. My mother Linda did what she always did. She smoothed over the tension with a refill of wine or a new topic, pretending the balance in our family was something fragile that could not be disturbed. A week before tonight's dinner, I was at my desk, going through invoices, when my personal email pinged. The address was unfamiliar, no subject line, just an attachment and a short message that read, "Thought you should see this." Against my better judgment, I clicked. The photo opened to show Noah standing outside a coffee shop talking to a woman with long auburn hair. They were close enough that from a distance it could have looked intimate. She was smiling, one hand resting on the strap of her bag, his head tilted slightly toward her. The timestamp was 2 days earlier. My stomach tightened. I read the email again, looking for context that was not there. No explanation, no demand, no name. Just the image. I wanted to believe it was nothing, that Noah could have been talking to anyone, but the timing was strange. The angle was deliberate, like someone had stood across the street and waited for the right moment. That night, I brought it up with Noah. He looked at the photo, exhaled slowly, and told me her name was Chloe Mason. The name was familiar in a distant, unpleasant way. Chloe had been one of Vanessa's closest friends years ago, the kind of friend who seemed to know every piece of family gossip. I remembered her at our house once, sitting on the porch with Vanessa, their heads bent together over something they did not want me to hear. According to Noah, he ran into Chloe outside a cafe after a client meeting. She stopped him, said she had not seen him in forever, and asked about the wedding. He swore it was a brief conversation. When I asked if Vanessa knew about it, he hesitated before saying probably. I wanted to believe him, but the pit in my stomach stayed. The more I thought about it, the more the photo felt like bait. I knew Vanessa had the ability to manipulate a situation until the story came out the way she wanted. I had seen her do it to coworkers, to boyfriends, to people who did not even realize they had been cornered until it was too late. The days leading up to the dinner felt heavier than they should have. My mother called to say she was looking forward to seeing us. My father mentioned a new business venture he wanted to share. Vanessa sent a group text with a casual note about trying a new restaurant by the water. She even added a smiley face at the end, which almost made me laugh because it was so out of place. I could not decide if she was being genuine or setting the stage for something I could not see yet. Noah was quieter than usual. When I asked if he was all right, he told me he just wanted to get through the evening without any scenes. I pressed him, but he shook his head, saying he would explain later. That in itself was unusual for him. He was the kind of man who believed in talking things through, but there was a weight in his voice that made me let it go for the moment. The night before the dinner, I dreamed of that photo. In the dream, the woman's hair was longer, her smile wider, and when I looked closer, it was not Chloe at all but Vanessa. She stood beside Noah, and they were both looking at me with the same unreadable expression. I woke up before dawn, the image burned into my mind, and could not shake the feeling that something was moving just beneath the surface. By the time the day arrived, I had decided I would watch everything closely. I would keep my answers short, my reactions measured. It was not paranoia if you had evidence, and that email was enough for me to stay on guard. Still, as we drove toward the coast, the sky streaked in shades of pink and gold, I caught myself wanting to believe it could all be fine. That maybe I was imagining the undercurrent, that the tension I felt was my own creation. When we walked into the restaurant and saw my family already gathered, Vanessa stood to greet us. She kissed my cheek, her perfume cloying and familiar, and told me I looked radiant. Her hands rested lightly on my shoulders as she smiled past me at Noah. For a second the room felt too small, the air too still. I told myself to breathe, to keep my eyes open, and to remember that every moment from here on could matter. We took our seats near the center of the long table, the low hum of conversation surrounding us like a current I could not quite step out of. The server came by with menus, but most of the dishes had already been chosen from Vanessa's earlier group message. Plates began arriving quickly, the scent of seared fish and roasted vegetables mixing with the faint salt in the air from the open windows. I kept my posture relaxed, my hands folded loosely in my lap, watching the way Vanessa's attention drifted from one person to the next. Noah reached for his water, the stem of the glass catching the light, then his napkin slipped from his lap onto the floor. He bent to retrieve it, and in that small pocket of shadow between the tablecloth and the clink of cutlery, his voice was low enough for only me to hear. "Your sister just put something in your plate." My chest tightened. I did not glance at the food. Instead, I smiled toward my mother, who was telling my uncle a story about a charity event she had attended. My pulse thudded in my ears. I leaned slightly toward Noah as he straightened, my voice a whisper behind the curve of my smile. "Are you sure?" His eyes met mine with a steadiness that left no room for doubt. He reached for my fork as if to tease me about my habit of picking at my food, and in the same motion slid his plate toward me, setting mine in front of him. Try this, he said casually, as though we were simply sharing bites like any couple would. He pulled my plate closer to his side and set his own fork down without taking a bite. I forced myself to join the conversation around me, nodding when someone mentioned the view, laughing softly at a joke my father made. The more normal I appeared, the less anyone would suspect. Inside, my mind was already dissecting every detail. What had she put in there? How long had Noah been watching her? And why was she doing this now in front of so many people? Then I noticed movement at the far end of the table. Chloe Mason was walking toward us, her hair perfectly styled, wearing a dress that shimmered faintly under the lights. She was not supposed to be here. No one had mentioned her, and the table had been full when we arrived. Yet now a chair was pulled up beside Vanessa, and she slid into it with the kind of easy confidence that comes from knowing you are welcome by the right person. Vanessa lit up, leaning toward her, their heads almost touching as they exchanged a quick whisper. Chloe looked around the table, her gaze landing on Noah and lingering just a second too long before she smiled. It was the kind of smile that carried a hint of knowledge, as though she was in on a joke the rest of us had not heard. I busied myself with my glass, sipping slowly while I listened. Chloe began speaking to my mother, recounting how she had run into Noah a week ago. She made it sound casual, but every detail was sharpened. She mentioned how surprised she was to see him alone, how they had such a nice chat about old times, how he seemed distracted as though he had a lot on his mind. My mother glanced at me, her expression polite but uncertain. Noah kept his face neutral, his hands folded on the table, but I could see the slight tension in his jaw. Vanessa nodded along, inserting small comments about how it must be nice to catch up with friends unexpectedly. Every word was measured, placed carefully into the air like pieces of a puzzle meant to be seen a certain way. I thought about the photo from the email, the way the angle had made it seem like more than it was. Now Chloe's story was shaping the same image in front of my family, one that could plant doubt without a single accusation. I kept my expression composed, my eyes moving from speaker to speaker as if I were merely an observer. The server brought another round of drinks, breaking the rhythm of the conversation. Chloe reached for her glass, her bracelet catching the light, and continued to talk about how she had always thought Noah was charming. Vanessa laughed, the sound too smooth, and said she hoped I knew how lucky I was. My fingers tightened slightly around my napkin, but I matched her laugh with one of my own, keeping it light enough to pass. Noah shifted in his seat, turning slightly toward me, his hand brushing mine under the table. It was a silent reassurance, a reminder that he was there, that he had already seen through whatever game was being played. I let the contact steady me even as my mind catalogued every word, every glance. Dinner continued, the plates changing, but the undercurrent staying the same. Vanessa and Chloe shared small asides, their eyes flicking toward me or Noah at carefully chosen moments. I responded when spoken to, asked polite questions, and never once touched the plate that now sat in front of Noah. He made no move to eat from it either. The night was still unfolding, but I could feel the edges of something larger pressing in. Whatever Vanessa had planned, it was meant to unsettle me, to shift the story in her favor. And now Chloe was part of it, her presence turning the evening into something far more calculated than a simple family dinner. I let the conversation flow around me, the clink of glasses and low laughter filling the spaces between my thoughts. There was no need to react now. I would have my moment, but first I needed to see just how far they were willing to go. When the dinner finally ended and we stepped out into the cool night air, I felt as if I had been holding my breath for hours. The sound of the ocean was louder out here, the waves breaking against the pier in steady rhythm. Noah's hand was warm at the small of my back as we walked toward the parking lot, the glow of the restaurant fading behind us. I waited until we were inside the car with the doors closed before speaking. What was in my plate? My voice was steady but low. He turned the key, letting the engine idle, and glanced at me with that same measured look he had worn all evening. I saw her take something from her bag, a small glass jar. She sprinkled it over your salad when she thought no one was looking. I recognized the color and the texture. It looked like crushed nuts. The words hit me like a punch. My throat tightened even at the thought. I have been severely allergic to hazelnuts since I was a child. It was not the kind of allergy you take lightly. 5 years ago, I had eaten a dessert at a friend's party without realizing it contained hazelnut paste. My lips went numb within minutes, my chest constricted, and I ended up in the emergency room hooked up to oxygen, shaking, while adrenaline pumped through my veins. The doctor told me I was lucky I had gotten treatment as fast as I had. Are you sure it was that? Noah's jaw tightened. I cannot be 100% until we test it, but I am not taking chances with you. He reached into a small takeout bag I had not noticed he was carrying. While the table was distracted, he had asked the server for the rest of my plate to be wrapped. The thought of him watching out for me that closely made my chest ache, but underneath the warmth was a sharper edge. Vanessa knew about my allergy. Everyone in my family did. She had seen the ambulance that night 5 years ago. We drove in silence for a while, the city lights blurring past the windows. I kept replaying the image of her smile when she slid the salad toward me, the subtle push of the bowl, the faint glint in her eyes. It was not careless, it was deliberate. I pressed my palms against my thighs to keep from shaking. Noah broke the silence. I know a private lab in Westwood that can run an allergen test overnight. A friend of mine used them for a case at work. If we drop this off tonight, we could have preliminary results by tomorrow. I nodded without hesitation. The idea of proof felt like the only solid thing in this whole mess. The lab was in a low building with frosted windows, the kind of place you would miss if you did not know it was there. Inside, the lighting was bright and sterile. A woman in a white coat met us at the counter. We explained we wanted to test for specific allergens. She took the container from Noah, asked a few questions about the food and how it had been stored, then told us they could start immediately. She promised to call with any early findings before morning. Back in the car, the adrenaline began to ebb, leaving a heavy weariness in its place. I leaned my head against the seat, watching the empty street ahead. If it came back positive, there would be no mistaking her intent. This was not an accident someone could explain away. It would mean she had tried to harm me, and not in some abstract emotional way, but in a way that could have sent me to the hospital or worse. I tried to imagine what my mother would say, how my father would react. Would they believe me? Or would they look for a reason to soften the edges of the truth the way they always had with Vanessa? The thought made my stomach turn. We got home just after midnight. I changed into an old t-shirt and sat on the couch, my phone in my hand, though I was not using it. Noah made tea, setting the mug in front of me before taking the seat beside me. His arm brushed mine, and I could feel the weight of his presence anchoring me. "You need to sleep," he said, but I could tell from his eyes that he knew neither of us really would. The call came at 8 the next morning. The lab technician's voice was calm but precise. Preliminary results showed the presence of hazelnut protein in the sample, finely ground and mixed into the dressing. It was enough to cause a severe reaction in someone with a high sensitivity. She said they would continue with full analysis for confirmation. I thanked her and hung up, my fingers cold against the phone. Noah was watching me, his expression unreadable. "It was there," I said. "Hazelnut." His eyes hardened, and for a moment we just sat there in the quiet, the truth settling between us like a stone dropped into deep water. The proof was beginning to take shape, and with it came the realization that this was only the first piece of whatever Vanessa had planned. I called Marcus Reed the same afternoon we got the lab results. He had worked with a friend of mine during a messy business dispute and came highly recommended. His voice over the phone was calm and deliberate, the kind of tone that made you believe he could slip into any situation without drawing attention. I told him everything from the dinner to the hazelnut in my salad. He asked for names, routines, and any patterns I could recall. When I mentioned Chloe Mason's sudden reappearance, there was a pause before he said he would start with both of them. By the next morning, Marcus had sent me a short update. Vanessa and Chloe had met twice that week at a cafe in West Hollywood. He attached a photo of them sitting outside, heads bent together, a manila envelope between them on the table. In one image, Chloe slid it across to Vanessa, who tucked it quickly into her bag. The sight made my stomach clench. It was one thing to suspect, it was another to see the pieces fitting together. I forwarded the images to Amanda Cole, my attorney. Amanda had been my legal sounding board since I bought my condo 3 years ago, and she did not waste words. Her reply came within minutes. If we can prove intent to harm your health, that is potentially a criminal matter. Attempted poisoning falls under assault in California. But you need airtight evidence. Suspicion and even photographs of meetings won't hold in court without the right context. I called her. Amanda's voice was sharp but reassuring. You need audio or direct witness testimony. If they discussed your allergy or anything that connects to your fiancé or the wedding, that's gold. I told her Marcus was on it. She reminded me to keep my own reactions contained. The last thing we needed was for Vanessa to suspect she was being watched. 2 days later, Marcus texted me a single line. You'll want to hear this. He attached an audio file and a note explaining he had been seated at the cafe 2 tables away from Vanessa and Chloe. They had not noticed him. He pressed record on his phone the moment Vanessa's voice dropped low enough to suggest she was saying something she didn't want overheard. I sat in my living room with the curtains half drawn, listening through earbuds. The background noise was soft clinking cups and low chatter. Vanessa's voice came through clear enough to cut. I don't care how we do it as long as Harper looks like a fool before that wedding day. If she loses face, Noah will back out. Chloe laughed a sharp little sound and said something about how easy it was to get people talking when you had the right bait. Vanessa replied, she's always been too trusting. All it takes is one public scene. I froze, the air in my chest turning heavy. There it was, spoken plainly. This wasn't about some petty sibling spat. She wanted to humiliate me enough to destroy my engagement. I thought of Noah, of the steady way he had switched our plates, of the way his eyes had locked on mine when he warned me. My pulse quickened, but my hand stayed steady as I forwarded the file to Amanda. She called almost immediately. This is substantial. If we can connect this to the hazelnut incident, we have both motive and method. It's not just social sabotage, it's intentional harm. Her tone shifted slightly, caution woven into it. But you need to decide how far you want this to go. Public charges against a family member can get ugly fast. I looked around my quiet apartment, the walls familiar and safe. The thought of a courtroom of my family hearing every detail made my stomach turn. But the alternative was letting Vanessa rewrite the story until I was the villain. That was not going to happen. Marcus checked in again that evening. He said Vanessa and Chloe had another meeting scheduled for Saturday morning. Same cafe, same corner table. He planned to be there before they arrived. I thanked him and asked if he thought they suspected anything. Not yet, he said, but they will eventually. People like this always think they're the smartest in the room, until they're not. That night I lay awake with the recording playing in my mind. The casual malice in Vanessa's tone was more cutting than if she had shouted. It was the kind of voice that came from certainty, from believing the outcome was already set. But she was wrong about that. She thought she was writing the ending. She had no idea I was already working on my own. The morning after I heard the recording, I woke with the kind of heaviness that comes from knowing the ground under your feet has shifted. I moved through my kitchen on autopilot making coffee, but my mind was already somewhere else. Vanessa's voice had lodged itself in the back of my skull, replaying without my permission. It wasn't just the cruelty of her words that stayed with me, it was the conviction. People only talk like that when they believe they have the leverage to make their plans real. I couldn't stop thinking about what kind of leverage she thought she had. By mid-morning, I decided I wasn't going to wait for it to reveal itself. I was going to look. That afternoon, I drove to my parents' house under the guise of returning some framed photos my mother had lent me months ago. The familiar streets of their neighborhood felt different now, as if every front lawn and mailbox was watching me pass. My parents' place sat at the end of a quiet cul-de-sac, the white shutters gleaming in the late sun. My mother greeted me at the door with a warm smile, but she seemed distracted, glancing toward the stairs. She said she was in the middle of changing sheets in the guest room and told me to leave the photos in the kitchen. I nodded, heart ticking a little faster. That gave me time. As I walked toward the kitchen, I caught a low murmur from my father's study. The door was half closed, but his voice carried. Numbers, accounts, a trust. I kept walking, not pausing long enough to be noticed, but my pulse quickened. When I heard his chair scrape, I ducked into the kitchen and busied myself at the counter. Seconds later, he passed through with his leather briefcase and hand-kissed my mother's cheek on the stairs and told her he'd be late. When the front door shut, the house was suddenly quiet. I waited until I heard my mother humming upstairs before I crossed the hall. The safe was behind a shallow closet in the corner of the living room, built into the wall behind coats no one wore anymore. I'd known the combination since I was 16 when my mother had asked me to lock away her pearls before we left for a vacation. I'd never used it without permission. Until now. The dial felt cold under my fingertips. Each click of the numbers sounded louder than I remembered. When the door released, the faint smell of paper and cedar drifted out. Stacks of documents sat in neat folders: insurance policies, property deeds, tax returns. Near the back was a thin envelope marked in my mother's handwriting with my name. I pulled it free and unfolded the pages. It was a will dated 3 years ago, witnessed and notarized. My father's estate was split evenly between Vanessa and me, but there was more. A separate trust significant in size, designated solely for me. It referenced the down payment on my condo and a savings account my mother had opened in my name. The math was simple enough. My share would be noticeably larger. Not double, but enough to spark resentment in someone who already believed I'd been favored all my life. My stomach tightened. If Vanessa had seen this or even heard about it, it would explain everything. The hostility, the deliberate attempt to harm me, the alliance with Chloe. I slid the papers back exactly as I had found them, aligning the edges, so no one would notice they had been touched. Closing the safe felt heavier than opening it. On the drive home, a memory from 2015 surfaced. Our cousin Emily had inherited her mother's flower shop, a small but thriving business near Santa Barbara. Vanessa had offered to help manage it after claiming Emily was overwhelmed. Within 6 months, Emily had signed over partial ownership. By the next year, she had no ownership at all. The shop was sold and Emily moved to Arizona. My father had brushed it off as an unfortunate business decision. But I remembered the way Emily's voice had broken when she told me Vanessa had promised to keep it in the family. That pattern, I realized, wasn't an accident. Vanessa didn't just want more. She wanted control, and she had always been willing to clear the board to get it. That evening I sat across from Noah at my dining table and told him everything I had found. His eyes didn't leave mine the entire time. When I finished, he leaned back, jaw tight. If she believes you're standing between her and money she thinks belongs to her, she's not going to stop. This isn't just about the wedding. Later I called Amanda. Her tone was measured but firm. A financial motive tied to a will changes the narrative. In court it's powerful. It shows long-term planning, not just a spur-of-the-moment attempt to humiliate you. But keep it to yourself for now. If she doesn't know you've seen that will, she can't change her behavior to cover her tracks. After we hung up, I stayed by the window for a long time, the city's lights glittering like scattered glass. The proof was piling up: the lab report, Marcus's recording, the will. Each piece fit neatly with the others. I could see the shape of her plan now, and I knew it wasn't a rushed job. She had been building it brick by brick. I felt the anger flare sharp and clean before it settled into something colder. I thought of her confident smile at the dinner table, the easy way she had slid the salad toward me. She believed the ending was already written. But I had read enough to know that endings could be rewritten. And I was going to make sure this one was mine. 2 days later, I was leaving a meeting downtown when I saw Grace Bennett waiting by the curb. She was Noah's younger cousin, a quiet, observant woman I'd only spoken to in passing at family gatherings. Her hands were tucked into the pockets of her navy coat, and she stepped forward as soon as she spotted me. "Harper, do you have a minute?" Her voice was low, almost careful. I glanced at my watch, nodded, and we moved to a quieter spot near the edge of the plaza. She pulled a small silver USB drive from her pocket and held it out. "I think you should see this." I didn't record it, but a friend of mine did. He was catering a private party for Vanessa last week. She was not careful about what she said. The drive felt heavier than it should as I slid it into my bag. Grace's eyes flicked toward the passing traffic before she added, I probably shouldn't get involved, but I like Noah. And I don't like watching someone play games with people's lives. Back in my apartment, I closed the blinds and plugged the drive into my laptop. The video opened on a dimly lit backyard strung with fairy lights, music thumping faintly under the sound of laughter. Vanessa stood near a fire pit, a glass of champagne in her hand, surrounded by 3 women I didn't recognize. Her voice was clear over the background noise. By the time the wedding comes, Harper will be out of the picture. She smiled like she was sharing an inside joke. One of the women laughed and asked how. Vanessa tilted her head, savoring the attention. Let's just say you can't marry into a family when you've been publicly humiliated. The camera panned slightly as the person filming moved, catching Chloe in the corner of the frame. She was speaking to a man in a dark suit, his back to the camera. When he turned, my chest tightened. Patrick Donovan. He had been the family's legal advisor for as long as I could remember. The footage showed Chloe accepting a thick envelope from him, tucking it quickly into her purse. I replayed that part twice, looking for any sign it could be misconstrued, but the exchange was too clean, too deliberate. I picked up my phone and called Noah. He answered on the second ring, and I told him what I'd just seen. Silence stretched for a beat before he said, Patrick was the one who handled our prenup. You remember that, right? Of course I remembered. I remembered sitting in his office, the smell of leather and paper, signing the document with Noah's hand warm over mine. I remembered the clause he had insisted was standard, one that would cost me financially if I was the one to end the engagement. At the time, it hadn't mattered. I'd believed there was no scenario in which that would happen. Noah's voice sharpened. If Vanessa is paying him or involving him in this, they could be using that clause as leverage. Make it look like you're walking away, trigger the penalty, and you lose. I ended the call and forwarded the video to Amanda. Within minutes, she called back, her tone clipped. This is significant. If Patrick is acting in bad faith while still tied to your legal agreement, it's a conflict of interest at best, fraud at worst. Do not confront him yet. Let me look into his recent dealings. After we hung up, I sat at my desk staring at the still frame of Chloe's hand closing over the envelope. The pieces were rearranging themselves in my head. This wasn't just Vanessa's scheme. It was a network with people who knew exactly how to manipulate the situation to their advantage. That night, Grace texted to ask if I had watched the video. I told her I had and thanked her. She replied with a single line. Be careful. She's bolder when she thinks no one is watching. I set my phone down and looked out over the city. Somewhere Vanessa was probably toasting herself again, certain the stage was set. But now I had more than suspicion. I had faces, voices, and proof that the circle around her was wider than I'd imagined. And every one of them had just stepped into the light. The next morning started with a phone call I almost didn't answer. The number was unfamiliar, and for a second I considered letting it go to voicemail. Something in me pushed to pick up. A calm, confident female voice introduced herself as Sarah Blake, an investigative journalist based in San Diego. She told me she had been following my sister's name for years, ever since a case in 2018 when a rival florist of Vanessa's had been hospitalized after a holiday charity gala. The woman had collapsed after taking a few sips from her drink, and whispers around the event claimed Vanessa had been seen nearby with the glass in her hand. There had been an investigation, Sarah said, but key evidence went missing, witnesses stopped talking, and the victim withdrew her complaint. I asked how she got my number. She admitted she had reached out to a contact in the legal community who knew about my engagement and the dinner incident. I leaned back against the kitchen counter, my coffee cooling beside me as she spoke. She sounded precise, organized, and utterly certain of her facts. She said she still had her files from the 2018 case, photographs, statements, and notes from sources who had since moved on. She believed what I was dealing with now might be connected. I hesitated, weighing the risk of letting an outsider in. Then she said, the way your sister operates, she counts on people keeping things separate. If we tie the threads together, we can make the picture too big to ignore. 2 hours later, I was sitting across from her at a small table in a coffee shop near the marina. She was in her late 40s with sharp eyes that missed nothing and a recorder set neatly beside her notebook. I slid a flash drive across the table. Inside were copies of the lab report, the video from Grace Marcus's audio, and the few documents Amanda had cleared me to share. Sarah studied the drive for a moment, then passed me a manila folder from her tote. Inside were photos from the 2018 gala, Vanessa in a red satin dress, smiling for the camera, and another of her standing only feet from the rival florist's table. There were statements from 2 former employees who claimed Vanessa had bragged about winning at any cost and removing obstacles in business. I told her about the dinner in Santa Monica, Noah's warning, and the salad laced with ground nuts. I described the recording Marcus captured and the video of Chloe taking the envelope from Patrick Donovan. Sarah listened without interrupting, jotting occasional notes. When I finished, she leaned in slightly. Patrick Donovan. That name showed up in my 2018 notes. He wasn't directly involved, but he represented a supplier Vanessa used back then. The same supplier who mysteriously stopped working with her competitor after the incident. Her phone buzzed on the table. She glanced at the screen, then tapped to open an email. "You're going to want to see this," she said, turning the phone toward me. The email contained a PDF from one of her financial sources. Highlighted in yellow was a bank transfer of $25,000 from Patrick Donovan's personal account to Chloe Mason's account. The date was exactly 3 days before the dinner. I stared at the screen. That kind of money wasn't casual. It was a payment, and the timing was too sharp to be coincidence. Sarah's eyes were steady. If we can prove that money was tied to what happened at that dinner, we're looking at conspiracy, maybe even solicitation of a crime. The fact that Patrick is still tied to your prenup makes it worse. I told her Amanda would need to see this immediately. Sarah agreed, but asked that I let her dig into both accounts first. "I'll find out where the money came from before it hit Patrick's account," she said. "If it traces back to Vanessa or someone close to her, that's the smoking gun." On the drive home, I kept replaying the PDF in my mind. The transfer was clean, labeled simply as consulting services. It was the kind of vague description people used when they wanted the truth buried under polite accounting. I called Amanda as soon as I got inside. She listened quietly, then said, "Harper, this gives us a direct financial link. If Chloe acted on Vanessa's orders and Patrick facilitated it, we can argue joint liability. That opens the door to subpoenas, depositions, and a very public unraveling." After hanging up, I sat at my desk and opened Sarah's folder again. The 2018 case was full of missed opportunities, but I could see how it mirrored what I was facing now. A rival. A sudden incident that could be passed off as an accident, a lack of tangible evidence at the time. The same names circling in the background. That night, Sarah sent me a text. "Starting to see the pattern. Keep your guard up." I looked out the window at the city lights, thinking about Vanessa somewhere laughing over drinks. Chloe counting money she thought was safe, and Patrick convinced his reputation was untouchable. They had built their confidence on the belief that no one could connect the dots. Now the dots were connecting themselves. And with each line drawn, their world was getting smaller. Noah and I sat at the dining table that night, papers spread out between us, the air thick with a sense of urgency. He leaned forward, elbows on the wood, eyes scanning the printouts I had arranged in neat stacks. We both knew we couldn't just sit on what we had. The pieces were strong individually, but if we presented them together in front of the right people, the impact would be impossible to ignore. I suggested we gather the family at my parents' house under the pretense of a casual dinner. Noah nodded slowly, already picturing the seating, the timing, the order of events. We would invite everyone directly connected to the threads Sarah and Marcus had uncovered. Vanessa, of course. Chloe under the guise of being a plus one, but, in reality, a central figure. Patrick Donovan because his signature on the prenup and that transfer to Chloe made him as much a player as anyone. And a handful of extended relatives who would serve as witnesses. Marcus agreed to be in the house, but out-of-sight, camera-ready, positioned where he could catch both wide angles and close-ups of every reaction. Sarah would pose as a guest of Noah's family, someone my parents had met once before at a fundraiser, giving her freedom to observe without suspicion. I spent the next day organizing evidence into a sequence that told the story clearly. First, the lab report confirming the presence of the ground nuts in my salad. Then the video from Grace's USB showing Vanessa bragging about removing me from the wedding. Next, Marcus's audio recording of her talking with Chloe about making me lose face. Finally, the bank transfer from Patrick to Chloe dated just before the dinner. I printed each piece in duplicate, slid them into protective sleeves, and arranged them in a slim binder. Late in the afternoon, as I was double-checking the order, my phone buzzed with a message from my cousin Elaine. It was short. Harper just heard from someone close to Vanessa. She's planning to drop something on Noah before the dinner. Some kind of proof he's not who he says he is. Be ready. I stared at the screen, pulse quickening. It was one thing to play defense with myself as the target, but dragging Noah into the crossfire was another matter entirely. I called Elaine immediately. She wouldn't say who told her, only that Vanessa had been hinting she had damaging material on Noah and that she was excited to reveal it in front of the family. Noah listened quietly as I relayed what Elaine had said. His jaw tightened, but his voice stayed calm. If she thinks she has something, we'll be ready for it. Maybe it's real, maybe it's fabricated. Either way, it's part of the same game. We agreed to adjust our plan. Instead of me leading the conversation, Noah would open it, making it clear he stood behind me and wasn't afraid of whatever she had to say. We would keep our evidence ready, but only bring it out after Vanessa made her move, allowing her to commit fully before we dismantled it. I called Marcus and Sarah to update them. Marcus's tone was dry but reassuring. If she's making things up, it's better. She says it on record. And if she's not, we deal with it. But she won't be walking away clean either way. The next morning, I drove to Amanda's office to drop off copies of the binder. She looked through the documents with the precision of someone who had built her career on details. Her advice was simple. Let her speak first. Do not interrupt, no matter how wild it gets. Then, when she's certain she's landed the blow, you drop the evidence in sequence. That night, Noah and I rehearsed the timing, even the pauses between each reveal. We walked through what questions might be thrown at us, how to redirect, and how to keep the room's attention. By the end of it, I felt a strange steadiness settle in my chest. The day before the gathering, Elaine sent another brief text. She's printing things out, says she'll prove Noah has been hiding things from you. I thanked her, told her to stay quiet, and promised to keep her name out of it. I sat in the living room after reading the message binder in my lap, the late afternoon light casting long shadows across the floor. Vanessa thought she was bringing a storm, but she had no idea she was walking into one that was already built, waiting and aimed directly at her. The night of the gathering, the air outside was cool and crisp, carrying the faint scent of the ocean even this far inland. As Noah and I walked up the path to my parents' front porch, the warm glow spilling from the windows felt almost deceptive. I could hear the hum of conversation from inside, the clink of glassware, the muffled laughter that sounded too light to be real. The binder was tucked tightly under my arm, my grip firm enough to crease the edges. Inside, my mother moved quickly between the kitchen and the dining area, her smile a little too bright when she saw us. My father was in his armchair talking with Patrick Donovan, who held a whiskey glass like it was an extension of his hand. Vanessa sat near the far end of the room in a low-backed chair, Chloe beside her in a sleek black dress, her expression unreadable. Dinner started as if nothing unusual was about to happen. Plates of roasted chicken, fresh bread, and vegetables passed around the table. Noah and I made polite conversation, keeping our tone neutral, though my mind tracked every glance, every shift in posture. Somewhere in the back, Marcus was already set up, his small camera angled to catch everything without drawing attention. Sarah sat near the corner of the dining room, her hands folded in her lap, blending in as if she were just another relative. When the first course was cleared, I caught Noah's eye. He gave a subtle nod, then set down his glass. I think it's time we shared why we asked everyone here tonight. His voice was calm but carried enough weight to pull the room's attention. Vanessa leaned back, a half smile tugging at her mouth. This should be good. Noah ignored her. At the dinner in Santa Monica, I saw Vanessa add something to Harper's salad. I knew she was allergic to certain nuts, so I warned her not to eat it. We switched plates. Later, we had the dish tested by a private lab. My mother's hand froze halfway to her water glass. My father straightened in his chair. I opened the binder and slid the first page forward. The lab report marked with the date and the name of the testing facility listed the presence of finely ground nuts. My allergy to them wasn't a secret in this family. I saw the recognition flash across my mother's face. Noah continued, his voice steady. If she had eaten that, we might not be sitting here right now. Vanessa rolled her eyes. You can't be serious. I turned a page in the binder and nodded toward Marcus. From the corner, his voice came through the small speaker he had set up, playing the recording from the cafe. Vanessa's voice, clear and sharp, talking about embarrassing me so the engagement would be broken. Chloe's voice joined in, laughing, adding her own suggestions. My father's expression tightened. That's your voice, Vanessa. People talk, she said with a shrug. It doesn't mean they mean it. Sarah leaned forward, her tone measured but firm. The problem is it matches other patterns. In 2018, you were under investigation for tampering with a competitor's drink in a dispute over a business contract. The case didn't move forward, but the witness statements didn't disappear. Vanessa's eyes narrowed. That's old news. Sarah laid out a printed bank statement. This is a transfer of $25,000 from Patrick's account to Chloe's, dated the same week as the Santa Monica dinner. Care to explain? Patrick shifted uncomfortably, his confident posture breaking. That was a personal matter. Before he could elaborate, I played the final piece, the video from Grace's USB. Vanessa, glass in hand, at a private party, bragging that she was about to make sure I wouldn't be at my own wedding. The background chatter, the smirks from those around her, all of it captured without any chance of misinterpretation. The room fell into a heavy silence. My mother's eyes filled with tears. I kept telling myself, you two just didn't get along. I didn't want to see it. My father sat back, jaw tight, saying nothing but watching Vanessa closely. Vanessa pushed her chair back with a sharp scrape against the floor. This is all fabricated. You've been planning this to turn everyone against me. Chloe shifted in her seat, her gaze fixed on the table. Then, without a word, she stood and walked out of the room, her heels clicking across the hardwood until the sound faded down the hallway. The smallest crack appeared in Vanessa's expression. It wasn't much, just a flicker of unease, but it was there. I didn't move, letting the silence stretch. The evidence lay on the table between us, and for once Vanessa had no quick answer that could twist it away. A week later, I woke to the vibration of my phone on the nightstand. Sarah's name lit up the screen with a link attached. The headline was blunt, sitting in bold above her byline: local business owner and attorney under investigation for alleged sabotage and fraud. I opened it, scanning line after line of precise detail. She had woven together the Santa Monica dinner, the bank transfers, the 2018 incident, and direct quotes from the recording Marcus captured. Vanessa's name appeared 7 times in the piece. Patrick's 5. There was no room for misunderstanding. By noon, my phone was flooded with messages from acquaintances I hadn't heard from in years. Some were offering sympathy, others fishing for more information. Noah read the article over my shoulder at the kitchen counter, then kissed my temple. This is better than we could have hoped for. The fallout started immediately. That afternoon, the largest wedding venue in the city canceled its floral contract with Vanessa's shop, citing a breach of professional ethics. By the next day, her biggest corporate client followed, releasing a short statement about upholding community values. I saw the notice online, a sterile sentence that cut sharper than any public insult. On the third day, a local television station ran the story, replaying clips from Sarah's article and flashing Vanessa's business sign on screen. Viewers watched B-roll of her shop's windows with the blinds drawn and the door locked in the middle of the afternoon. The anchor's voice was measured, but the implication was unmistakable. Then came the formal summons. Vanessa was requested to appear before the county investigation board regarding potential criminal conduct. The envelope arrived by certified mail, and, though I wasn't there to see her reaction, Sarah texted me a photo of the sealed notice with the timestamp of delivery. Patrick didn't fare better. The State Bar Association issued an inquiry into his license, reviewing his recent cases and financial dealings. A legal blog picked up the story, adding their own analysis about conflicts of interest and ethics violations. The comment section lit up with former clients and rival attorneys sharing their own stories. Meanwhile, Noah's lawsuit for defamation against Vanessa and Chloe moved faster than we anticipated. His attorney called to say the judge had agreed to an expedited schedule given the strength of the evidence. Within the week, Chloe's lawyer reached out to negotiate, offering a settlement. Noah refused. "I want this on record," he said. "In between these developments, I tried to go about my days normally, but every errand seemed to bring a reminder." A barista at the coffee shop glanced up from her phone and gave me a small, knowing smile. A neighbor I barely knew stopped to say she had read the article twice. It felt strange being the subject of so many conversations I wasn't part of. On the 6th day, an envelope slid through our mail slot bearing Patrick's letterhead. Inside was a formal cease and desist notice demanding that I stop making public statements and remove any mention of his name from any records. The tone was clipped, the legal jargon deliberate, but it couldn't hide the desperation beneath the formality. I took it straight to Amanda's office. She read it once, set it down, and leaned back in her chair. "He really thinks this is going to intimidate you. He's hoping it will," I said. Amanda smiled a slow curve of certainty. "Then let's give him something else to think about." By that afternoon, she had compiled the full case file, lab reports, recordings, videos, financial statements, and sent it directly to the district attorney's office. No cover letter, just a short note attached. For immediate review in connection to ongoing investigation. That night, I sat by the window with a cup of tea, the city lights flickering beyond the glass. The hum of traffic was steady, the kind of sound that faded into the background when you weren't listening. I thought of Vanessa, of Patrick, of Chloe, all now pulled into the current they had stirred themselves. The wheel was turning faster than they had planned, and none of them could stop it. I didn't feel triumphant, not exactly. It was something quieter, steadier, like watching a storm you had tracked on the radar finally break over the horizon. You didn't make the wind blow or the clouds form, but you knew they were coming and you knew exactly where they would land. In the weeks that followed, life settled into a rhythm I hadn't known was possible after everything. Vanessa was gone. Her florist shop closed indefinitely, its windows boarded up, and the sign faded from years of neglect. I heard through a few old family friends that she had relocated to a small town several states away, trying to escape the fallout. Rumors followed her, whispers of ruined reputation and lost opportunities. The town she chose was supposed to be a fresh start, but I doubted anyone there was unaware of the storm she had left behind. Back at my parents' house, the air was lighter than it had been in years. My mother, Linda, had been reaching out more often, sending texts and calling just to check in. The walls that had held so much tension between us seemed to be slowly dissolving. One afternoon, she pulled me aside after dinner, tears shining in her eyes. She told me she was sorry. Sorry for turning a blind eye to the warning signs, sorry for the silence when I needed her the most. I didn't know what to say at first. Her apology felt like a fragile bridge reaching out to me, and I wanted to cross it. My father, Daniel, was more reserved. He didn't say much about the scandal or the investigations, but the way he looked at me now was different, less dismissive, more cautious, and I sensed a growing pride beneath his stoic exterior. He even surprised me one evening by inviting Noah and me for a quiet dinner to discuss plans for the wedding. For the first time, the conversation was warm and inclusive, a far cry from the cold politeness of months before. Noah and I threw ourselves into wedding preparations with new energy and hope. Invitations were carefully chosen and sent out, venues were toured and booked, and every detail was discussed as if we were building not just a day, but a foundation for a life together. The support from both our families was genuine, now free from the undercurrents of tension that had once threatened to tear us apart. One lazy Sunday afternoon, I was sitting on the porch with a book when my phone buzzed quietly beside me. The screen lit up with a message from an unknown number. It read, "Thank you for stopping when you did." You don't know how far they could have gone. I stared at the words for a long moment, feeling a strange mix of gratitude and caution. I saved the message, a quiet reminder that vigilance would always be necessary no matter how much peace I thought I'd found. It was an acknowledgement that the fight I'd waged wasn't just mine, it was part of a larger web of deceit and power that reached far beyond my family. As the sun